Hello and welcome back to this series that I resolutely refuse to call Chats in Tight Spaces, where we talk about the video game Fights in Tight Spaces. No video today because of the perils of rural broadband, but I'm once again joined by lead designer and ground shatter man, James Parker.
Hello.
So that was an extremely bombastic and majestic intro there, James.
Well, that's bombastic and majestic are my two main traits.
Today we're going to be talking about game design because we had some good response to that last time, and also game design is interesting, and the game is at a very sort of intriguing point right now. So we currently have a build that I'm calling sort of the defining build of this period, certainly one that kind of maps out the direction for the game.
Yeah, so I suppose the big things that have been happening recently from a design and to some extent execution point of view, I've been rebalancing a lot of things. So making sure that the player's momentum and the card costs kind of make sense as a system, and then also against the health of the player and the amount of damage that the enemies can do, and all the kind of classic balance things. Just trying to create more interesting situations and kind of gameplay situations, and eliminate some of the more either tedious or exploitable ways to play the game. So to make it a bit more interesting for the player and give them more interesting choices.
That is, we were saying earlier, that combination of things where it's sort of about thinking about the way in which playing the game is fundamentally interesting, and also the level of decision making involved, is a pretty tricky area for designers. And I was conscious of this when giving feedback last time around. I mean, and the feedback was sort of largely the decisions aren't complex enough yet. And one of the reasons for that was you kind of mentioned momentum, which is our sort of, I guess that's our mana system roughly, isn't it? Incomparable to other games. Um, it was too easy for the player to kind of move in and out, do trivial moves, and then get out of the way. So it's interesting that that stuff was kind of the solution to that problem.
Yeah, we've been through quite a lot of iterations of the game, and initially it was quite expensive to move around, so it was more about and the attacks were very cheap, but they would give you more momentum, so you were encouraged to fight more and move less. And then we went through a version where movement was very cheap and easy to do, um, which ended up with a situation where, like you say, you could kind of bob and weave all around, but it made it there was very little jeopardy in that. So whilst it made it quite exciting viscerally, you could fight loads of guys and come away unscathed. There wasn't actually a lot of it was too obvious. The solution was to wade in, land a bunch of punches, and then jump straight back out again, and there was no real jeopardy for you as the player.
How do you think generally with a game like this that has quite a few interlocking systems, how do you get that balance right between trying to design in abstract without adding too many mechanics and systems, and then throwing stuff in to sort of see how it feels? Like, how do you resolve that, and how do you think kind of designers generally can approach that problem?
I think for me, having a kind of useful toolkit of things is important. So the fact that I can go ahead and change all of the values in the game fairly easy for the different cards and different characters means I can try stuff out um, at the touch of a button, essentially. So I can keep on iterating without necessarily asking for new mechanics and features, as long as from the get-go we understand what those elements are going to be.
Yeah, so I suppose it's largely about sort of creating a setup that gives you and others kind of quick feedback about those decisions. I think in my experience, designers tend to either go too intuitive in that they sort of build out lots and lots and lots of content and then kind of swim in it for a while, getting increasingly despairing when they don't have a core design, or they kind of go a bit too much the other way and sort of worry about getting things perfect on paper first before jumping in. So I guess it's like everything, it's just essentially a balance of sort of roughly knowing where you're going and then trying stuff, I guess.
Yeah, I've always been quite technical, I suppose, as on the spectrum of game designers. So I program as well, so I've always been able to make changes myself where needed. So I'm very much a kind of implement and play with digitally rather than necessarily a doing stuff on paper first type of person. Even when I was prototyping this originally and I was doing it using physical board game pieces on a chessboard, all of the card stuff I still did on. I made a little version of the game that just dealt cards because that was easier than drawing them or printing them out.
Yeah, yeah. I think something that we're kind of moving towards as well. We just had a conversation about trying to create an idealized game situation, and this is something that I kind of increasingly like as a sort of design trick, especially in a complex game. And this actually came out of publishing, really, because it's often so hard to evaluate a game by playing its early levels or its tutorial and then trying to learn it. I would much rather see a competent player playing an ideal, fun situation in a game and see what decisions they're making and how they're doing it, and that kind of gets my skill out of the way. So, yeah, is that something you think is going to be useful, and or does that potentially have some limits to it as well?
Well, yeah, it's definitely useful, and I think that's probably what we did in early versions of Fits
Yeah,
was create here's your, I guess I suppose a midpoint in the game where you understand everything that's going on. You've got a range of abilities available to you, and you can fight a range of bad guys. So even if people were coming to it and they'd never seen the game before, they'd get an impression of what it would be like when they were some way progressed in the game. And I think again that's going to be useful now in terms of balancing that we need the game to feel good throughout. So just having a first level that works is of limited value if uh, some hours down the line and players playing it and it's stagnated for whatever reason. So yeah, I think the only potential drawback is you work so hard for the idealized version that it's hard to pull back from that. It's hard to know which facets of that you can remove if you've
mm,
invested so heavily in it that you start to worry that none of that stuff you could afford to lose. Um,
right. Yeah, the
but,
game
but I
only
think
becomes good in the mid game. That can be a problem.
yes, exactly. So I think for the phase up till now, I've been a bit mindful of that and been trying to make sure that because of the nature of the deck building game, the initial hand you get needs to be understandable to players who've never played it before. It needs to be useful enough to clear those first few levels. But also, if you've played it a bunch of times, then you need to know exactly how to use those cards to clear those first levels easily, and then move on to the more interesting stuff and developing your particular style.
It was really interesting for me recently, revisiting two games that you sort of cited as your influences for this, Into the Breach and Slay the Spire, and just looking at how very singular those games are stylistically. Like Into the Breach was harder than I remember it, and I remember it being hard initially. And it's such a specific game; it really punishes you for if you don't think everything out, you will just lose immediately. And I think that's part of the attraction of that game. Whereas Slay the Spire always feels a lot looser to me and a lot more sort of relaxing. And I think that may be some of the secret to that game's success, where you can play it at quite a sort of low, relaxing tempo, but also it has this incredible depth and detail that you can get into, and you can learn to play sort of optimally if you're that kind of maths brains person. It feels like we're sort of going almost up the middle of those two things slightly. Like it fits as it is currently is quite punishing if you don't pay attention, but it also won't destroy you instantly in one level.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because both of those games treat some element of failure as inevitable.
Yes.
Um, but Into the Breach is definitely more punishing with it. But a lot of the choices you make in Into the Breach are like, well, if I'm not going to do anything about that attacker, they're going to hit one of my cities and they're going to and that's going to cause me problems. But the alternative to that is I lose one of these mechs, which means a few turns down the line, I'm just going to be completely dead. So yeah, it always forces you to make difficult decisions, and you know that you're going to lose something at some stage.
Yes.
Whereas in Slay, it's very rare for you to get through a fight without losing some health. You know that there's an inevitability about that, and you have ways to mitigate it, or you know ultimately that you're going to be able to recover your health some way down the line. So they're both fairly successful in going, don't treat your first little bit of failure as the end of the game. Absorb that, understand what you're going to do about it, and then plan around it.
Yeah, I think that idea of sort of health as a currency rather than a sort of metric of success is kind of interesting in Spyro, and we've started to have some of that in Fits. I mean, something that you added in this, well, I wouldn't say added, but probably refined in this version was secondary objectives. So we have protecting the ambassador character, which is something that you saw in the trailer. We have other things like, you know, items that you need to get in a level that optional things that will give you a bonus. So that to me adds to that kind of transactional quality of, if I eat some damage here, I might be able to pay to get health back at this point, but then also, you know, that kind of multi-tiered decision.
Yeah, so those things, particularly the ambassador, is very useful because it forces you to decide if an attack's coming in, whether you're going to take the damage or whether the ambassador's going to take the damage, and things like that. You've got then a set of extra choices that is also thematically appropriate. Yeah, treating your health as, like you say, a currency then becomes another choice that you're making as you play.
All right, so before we wrap up, could you talk a bit about what you're going to be working on next week and the new things people might see subsequently?
Yeah, so my focus at the moment is implementing some of the slightly more unusual card abilities. So whereas at the moment, most of the things that will have been seen in the trailers are the movement cards and the attack cards and the kind of wall takedowns and such like. They're quite straightforward moves. Whereas we've got quite a lot of mechanics that we can layer on top of that. So cards which may do an attack but also increase your momentum or give you extra health, or cards that enable you to manipulate your deck while you're playing. So discarding cards to pick up cards of a certain type, and those extra kind of layers of deck manipulation and energy and health manipulation in order to achieve a bigger ends. So it's about, I think you've said it before, card synergy, about having cards that change your choices of other cards.
All right, great stuff. Thank you once again. And please, if you are watching this, please do all the YouTube things. Join the Discord, wishlist the game, just to make us feel better. And we will see you soon. Goodbye.
Bye.